Picture a tense meeting room in London on May 12, 2025, where European leaders, their faces etched with determination, pore over screens filled with data and maps. Around the table, representatives from France, Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the European Commission form the Weimar Plus Group, a united front grappling with a crisis that has shaken the world for 3 years, the war in Ukraine. That day, they decide to strike hard, very hard. A week later, on May 20th, 2025, the European Union, EU, and the UK unveil a 17th sanctions package against Russia, an economic weapon designed to force Vladimir Putin to halt hostilities and come to the negotiating table. But behind these bold headlines lies far more than a political decision. It's a geopolitical, economic, and moral battle that ripples across the globe, from the ports of Rotterdam to the gas stations in your neighborhood. Why does this moment matter so much? Because these sanctions, as ambitious as they are, could reshape the future for Ukraine, Europe, and even for you, the young generation who will live in the world they create. Let's dive into this gripping story, full of twists, massive stakes, and dilemmas that touch us all. The story begins, or rather continues, with a conflict that has upended the global order. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, sparking a war that 3 years later shows no sign of ending. Cities like Kharkiv and Mariupol lie in ruins, millions have fled, and images of shattered families or leveled buildings flood social media feeds. Faced with this tragedy, the EU has wielded a powerful weapon: economic sanctions. Since the war began, it has rolled out 16 rounds of restrictions, targeting everything from Russian oligarchs with their lavish yachts to banks funding the Kremlin. Yet Russia has proven surprisingly resilient. Through a so-called shadow fleet, roughly 200 oil tankers sailing under discreet flags to sell oil despite Western restrictions, Moscow keeps its coffers full. In 2024, these oil exports brought Russia an estimated $180 billion, according to analysts, fueling tanks, drones, and missiles. This is where the May 2025 sanctions come in, with a clear goal: to choke off the Kremlin's funds once and for all. Unveiled on May 20th, this 17th package is staggering in scope. For starters, it bans 189 additional ships from this shadow fleet from accessing European ports. Picture massive oil tankers, flying flags of convenience, now barred from docking in Hamburg, Marseille, or Antwerp. These vessels, carrying millions of barrels of oil, are a lifeline for Russia's revenue. By blocking them, the EU hopes to dry up a critical source of war funding. But that's not all. The sanctions also target 75 individuals, business tycoons, military officers, Kremlin insiders, and 30 companies, often tied to Russia's arms industry. Their bank accounts in Europe are frozen, their travel visas revoked. The UK, no longer part of the EU but a key ally, joins in with 82 new designations, hitting pivotal players in Putin's system, from financiers to drone manufacturers. Why this escalation now? To understand, we need to rewind to the Weimar Plus meeting in London on May 12, 2025. That day, European leaders, backed by the United States, issued an ultimatum to Russia: accept a 30-day unconditional ceasefire by the end of the day. The idea was straightforward: give peace a chance, let Ukraine breathe, and pave the way for talks. But Putin, true to form, rejected the offer outright. Instead, he proposed negotiations in Istanbul 3 days later, on May 15th. For Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign policy chief, this was a blatant stalling tactic. And the evidence backed her up. That same night, Ukraine faced a barrage of 273 drones, according to the Ukrainian military, a terrifying show of force proving Russia had no intention of slowing down. Faced with this defiance, Europe decided to up the ante, and the May 2025 sanctions were born as a direct response to this escalation. But these sanctions, as bold as they are, aren't a magic fix. They're part of a complex strategy with far-reaching consequences. First, they aim to hit Moscow where it hurts: its wallet. Oil accounts for about 30% of Russia's state revenue, and by targeting the shadow fleet, the EU hopes to slash those funds significantly. But Russia has already shown it can adapt. Since 2022, it has redirected its oil exports to countries like China, India, and Turkey, who buy it at discounted rates. In 2024, China imported a record 107 million tons of Russian oil, according to trade data. These countries, often reluctant to join Western sanctions, keep Russia afloat. So, even with these new measures, the Kremlin might still find workarounds like alternative trade routes or cryptocurrency payments. Then there's the fact that these sanctions don't just target Russia, they also go after companies in third countries like Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, or even China, suspected of supplying dual-use goods, technologies that can serve civilian purposes but also be repurposed for weapons. For instance, a chip in your smartphone could also power a military drone. By targeting these players, the EU aims to close every loophole in the system, but this comes with risks. Turkey, a NATO member, walks a tightrope between the West and Russia. Sanctioning its companies could strain ties with Ankara, a key partner for Europe. Similarly with China, whose trade with Russia hit a record $240 billion in 2024, targeting its firms could spark a trade war. Imagine shortages of tech products or price hikes on your favorite gadgets. That's a real possibility. For Ukraine, these sanctions are a lifeline. 3 years into the war, the country is exhausted, but Western support remains critical. Since 2022, the EU has poured $144 billion into Ukraine through weapons, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction efforts, according to official figures. The May 2025 sanctions show that this commitment hasn't wavered, even if some European countries like Hungary are dragging their feet. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has repeatedly criticized sanctions, arguing they hurt Europe more than Russia. This lack of unity is a real headache. In the EU, sanctions require unanimous agreement from all 27 member states, and a single veto can derail everything. Behind the scenes, diplomats are working overtime to keep the coalition together. But let's talk about what this means for us in Europe, and especially for you, the younger generation. These sanctions are a high-stakes gamble. By cutting off Russian oil, the EU risks driving up energy prices. In 2023, previous sanctions already pushed gas prices in Europe up by 40%, and experts warn of a similar spike in 2025. What does that mean in real terms? Higher heating bills for your family, pricier bus tickets, or even more expensive groceries, since everything from clothes to food depends on energy for production and transport. A post on X captured the frustration of many. We're trying to punish Putin, but we're the ones paying the price. This boomerang effect is real. Sanctions hurt Russia, but they also hit our wallets. Then there's the environmental angle, which hits home for your generation. By reducing reliance on Russian gas, Europe is pushing for green energy like wind and solar. But that transition takes time, and in the meantime, we're falling back on dirtier alternatives like coal. A 2024 report estimated that sanctions on Russian gas increased Europe's CO2 emissions by 7%, a bitter irony when we're all talking about fighting climate change. For young people who march for the planet, this is a frustrating contradiction. How do you support Ukraine while protecting the environment? On a global scale, these sanctions are deepening a divide between two blocs. On one side, the West, EU, UK, US, stands united against Russia. On the other, powers like China, India, and Iran keep doing business with Moscow, fueling a kind of Cold War 2.0. This split could have lasting consequences: disrupted supply chains, heightened diplomatic tensions, and a world increasingly split in two. For young people, this means growing up in a world where rivalries between nations could complicate everything from trade to cooperation on issues like climate change. But at the heart of it all is the human cost. In Ukraine, millions live under the daily threat of bombings. Sanctions, imperfect as they are an attempt to end this nightmare. On social media, the debate rages. Some influencers, sharing images of resilient Ukrainian civilians, call for unwavering support for Kiev. Others, more skeptical, argue sanctions are a drop in the bucket, pointing to Russia's ability to adapt. They sell their oil elsewhere, and we're stuck with inflation, one ex-post read. This divide even splits young people, torn between solidarity with Ukraine and worries about their own futures. So, where do we go from here? The May 2025 sanctions are a bold bet. They show that Europe and the UK remain committed to Ukraine even at a cost. But they raise burning questions. Will they be enough to make Putin back down, or will they just escalate tensions and costs for everyone? The Istanbul talks proposed by Russia led nowhere, and the hoped-for ceasefire remains elusive. Meanwhile, Ukraine holds on, but the human and material toll grows heavier every day. For you, the younger generation, this crisis isn't just a headline scrolling by on your feed. It's a story that shapes your future, the prices you'll pay, the global tensions you'll navigate, the planet you'll inherit. These sanctions are a bid for peace, but they're also a challenge for your generation. So what do you think? Are these measures the right move, or do they risk making things harder without changing much? Speak up, share your thoughts, your fears, your hopes, because this world, shaped by sanctions, wars, and choices, is yours to inherit. Tell us what you think, and let's imagine what it could become.